think we might resume. So I welcome the witnesses here today. And the witnesses now for this sector are from the Department of Defence. You may have all appeared at Senate committees before, but I just remind you that for the Hansard record, could you each please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Brendan Sargeant. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Department of Defence.
Thank you.
I'm Mike Gibson. I'm here as the Acting Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you.
Good morning, Air Commodore Hayden Marshall. I'm the Director General Support at Headquarters Operations Command.
Thank you very much. The committee has received your submission as submission 17 and answers to questions on notice. Do you wish to make any amendments or alterations to your submissions or to the answers?
No, Chair.
No? I just remind the witnesses that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give an opinion on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister if necessary. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I also remind you that any claim that would be contrary to the public interest to an answer to a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for that claim. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
No.
No. Okay. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm not sure who wants to take the question, but I'm interested in the transition period post-2014 and the areas where Australia should be focusing our aid. Some previous witnesses today have highlighted that they think one of the most effective ways is to build on local education programs, so in local communities, whether it be trade schools, education, etc., that have the support of the village elders and religious leaders, etc. In the experience Defence has to date, do you have any statistics about the number of regions where local elders are supportive and the security and effectiveness of programs have been verified and continued, or have those local programs required Defence presence to actually maintain security?
I'll make a general comment, and then if Air Commodore wants to elaborate, he may. When our approach to the transition, our objectives in Afghanistan have always been to support the development of the Afghan National Army, and particularly through the development of the 4th Brigade. And the underlying reason for that is that for future development of the Afghan state and Afghan civil society rests on the foundation of the capacity of the Afghan government to provide for the security of population, and as part of that you need a functioning unified defence force. And so that's been the direction of Australia's contribution. And as we transition out, we would expect that the Afghan government and community, with the assistance of aid programs, would then develop their priorities as to where they want to put their effort in terms of future capacity building and future development. And so we, from my knowledge, haven't really undertaken the sort of research or work that you've been talking about. I mean, to me, that would be a question that's better directed at AusAid. Our focus has been on the development of the ANA.
Okay, if we could just come to that then. I take it you're aware of the program that Four Corners are planning to screen Monday night called Mission Accomplished, which looks at our work in Afghanistan and the efficacy of the ANA and police.
I'm aware that Four Corners are going to do something, yeah.
Was that program produced with defence input and cooperation, or is that an independent activity that they've undertaken?
I'm not sure, actually. I'd need to check that. I mean, journalists and media organisations ask us for information and we provide it. I'm not sure of the details in relation to Four Corners.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, thanks, Chair.
Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I put in some questions on notice. In the number 5 one, it was a question about whether ADF's ODA projects are operational. Of 48 projects, there's no information available on 31 of the projects. It does seem remarkable that 65% of the projects you have no information on. And then in question 14, which was about records of attack, of the 48 projects, there have been 3 reported attacks, and in 32 cases it's stated that it's unknown if there have been any attacks. That comes in at 67%. Can you explain how it comes that you have no information on this? And I was just wondering, does it mean you have no information, or monitoring was undertaken but it hasn't been reported?
Commodore Marshall, having a look at the list of the projects, once responsibility for that project has been handed over to the relevant authority, monitoring from that perspective is complete. So once we've finished construction, the defect liability period has expired, and we've undertaken a handover with the relevant government authority. Further monitoring is not undertaken.
But can you say when the monitoring stopped, when the reporting stopped?
It would be, as I say, commensurate with the completion of the construction activity.
So you're saying there was a period, so you would be able to supply information about these projects?
Only with regards to progress of construction.
So why wasn't that information supplied?
Again, my assumption is, and that's always dangerous, is that it's reporting project status as at today, or as at the day the report was compiled.
So to ask the question again, you would have information about these projects, but you're saying under your rules that you then do not report them further once you cease an involvement with them?
The activity is complete from our perspective.
But surely part of the responsibility here is to ensure that these projects work in terms of the objectives that are set out, and the key reasons that we're in Afghanistan. So hasn't there been some ongoing relationship that requires reporting?
I think that goes to the basis under which the projects were undertaken in the first place, in that these were about building relationships with the local communities, and on delivery of that particular capability, whether it be a bazaar, hospital accommodation, a bridge crossing, from the defence perspective, with the delivery of that project, the responsibility has been completed, and therefore no further monitoring of the efficacy or in fact suitability of the project is largely complete.
But if you look at the table, so this is table 1 in this question 5 where you've responded. We've got fully operational 12, which is 25%, partially operational 3, not operational 2, then no information available 31. So when you read no information available after looking at the previous 3 columns, which is all about the status of if it's operational or not, you're left with the impression that that ADF has no information even if it's operational. So is that a correct conclusion? Because it certainly would appear that is the only thing you can conclude when you look at that table.
And I think that's a fair conclusion, that the responsibilities of the provincial reconstruction team in Taron Cot, once the projects have been delivered, then move on to other activities. I believe we've also provided, in regards to the question on notice as well, an indication as to when these activities were conducted. And that would then provide an indication as to why we're no longer monitoring those activities, because they have been completed, some of them several years ago.
But there would seem to be still a contradiction in this table. If you're saying, well, why we're not reporting on them is because we've moved on, well, why do we have a column called fully operational, which reports 12 projects come in at 25%? That would seem to be where you have a clear contradiction with the 4th column, no information available. If you're arguing that under no information available, that's because they're fully operational, we no longer have to report on them?
Senator, we didn't say that. We said it's as written, we don't know. We have no information, so we're unable to report. That the projects may or may not be viable. Some of those projects were construction projects which were handed over to the community. Once the ADF has done their job, it leaves. It's really up to the community to use that resource as it sees fit. And in some cases, we don't know what has happened after that's taken place.
I still ask that question again. What's the difference between column 1 and column 4?
Well, column 1, to my reading, is that we're aware that the project is working, and if you look at the table that accompanied the response, for example, there's a project, Taron Cot Waste Management, civil works fully operational. We know that that project is working, I assume because it's waste management and therefore critical to infrastructure in Taron Cot. Another project, Chora Food Storage Cellars, we don't have any information.
And picking up on that point, the TK waste management piece, we've only just recently completed the construction piece, so it's currently in the defect liability period as we speak, and therefore we have full awareness of what the status is of that project, because we are monitoring it through to completion of the contracted requirements with the relevant construction contractor. So, as I said, we've been in a position to be able to provide that specific advice. And again, as Mr. Sargeant indicated, the food storage cellars in Chora were completed some time ago, and therefore we're not in a position to be able to provide up-to-date advice as to their current status.
And then also moving on to the one about the attacks on these projects. This is question number 14. Because the figures come in there that there have been 3 reported attacks, and in 32 cases it's unknown if there have been any attacks. So again, why is it not known?
As we've been working through security transition in the province, there's been certainly public reporting that's indicated that our mentoring and advising arrangements have drawn back to the operating base at Taron Cot. So therefore we no longer have the reach that we have had in previous years to be able to go out and ascertain validity of information, or in fact collect information on these projects or status of security in the province. So we are now very reliant on reports from the ANSF and reports that come through the control centre as to status of security through the province. So it's just reflective of previously we've had assets out and about as part of our mentoring and advising activities, as well as reconstruction tasks, and as those activities are drawing back to allow the ANA in particular to take greater responsibility itself, our ability to be able to monitor and collect information has changed.
So in question, following on from that, in question 13, again the question's on notice, you state that the projects are, and I'm quoting, routinely evaluated after completion. So the assumption there is that you're doing the evaluation, but from what I'm hearing, the ADF's not doing it, and if it does happen, we're not sure, and maybe it's the Afghan forces who are doing it. So is that the conclusion we draw from what you've said? So, or are you routinely evaluating after completion as it's stated in question 13?
Senator Rhiannon, you might like to define your terminology, what your understanding of evaluation is, because evaluation of the effectiveness of a project is very different to the evaluation of the effectiveness of the construction
Mr. Chair,
of
I
the
don't
building.
think it's up to me to answer questions. I'm just quoting from the answers that have been provided and trying to understand the situation.
We can ask the witnesses what exactly you mean by evaluation. It's effectiveness or construction, that sort of thing, so it's clearer for Senator Rhiannon.
It's the delivery of the project. So you have a construction project. Does the building stand up? Was it completed? Is it fit for use? Does it meet all building codes, regulations and standards? And does it fit the purpose for which it was provided? That's a different issue from its use or its value to the community over time, which might be the subject of a different sort of evaluation.
Thank you.
So thank you for clarifying that. But I get back, and maybe it's to Commodore Marshall, to my original question. Considering we don't have the information and taking the answer that you've just given, but in the answer to question 13, it states the projects are routinely evaluated after completion. Does that happen or doesn't it?
It does, in terms of, as indicated, for assessment for fitness for purpose and the construction standards, and as indicated, there is a defect liability that accompanies many of the construction projects, and that's again where the evaluation takes place to ensure that the final product is suitable for the purpose that it was intended, and is handed over to the relevant authorities accordingly.
So do you see that you appear to have a problem, considering that there's, under the unknown column, it's coming in at 67% in terms of attacks, 65% in terms of the about the evaluation of the projects themselves? That is a high level, considering you're saying that their evaluation is carried out.
What it means is that the projects were completed, they were handed over to the appropriate authorities, and that we haven't gone back since then to do an evaluation as to their effectiveness. And it means no more than that.
But Mr. Sargeant, it says routinely. I think most people understand routinely means regularly, frequently. Well, and they're your words, routinely evaluated after completion.
Well, my understanding of routine is that it means that your process of ensuring that the project is complete is part of your processes for introducing it into or handing it over to relevant authorities. It doesn't mean that you continue to look at that project over time.
So what we do know from your table is that in 33% of the projects that have been reported on, there was attacks in 4% of them. Were any lives lost in the attacks, or was anybody injured?
I don't know. We'd have to take that on notice.
So that's not part of your reporting?
No. No, again, because if we've not had our own assets in the area, the verifying of the information is going to be difficult.
So considering the discrepancies that are now apparent in these projects, are you confident that these is in keeping with best practice ODA and is in keeping with the OECD standards with regard to OED projects, ODA projects?
I think that our judgment about the effectiveness of the projects is whether they support the ADF mission. If they have an incidental benefit in terms of ODA categorisations, that's all to the good, but that's not the primary purpose for which those projects are done.
So how can you make that assessment, leaving the ODA standards aside, within the context of the ADF's objectives under which they work? How can you make that assessment when you're not looking at so many of these projects?
Well, it goes back to the mission of the ADF in Afghanistan. Is to build, is to create or support the ability of the 4th Brigade to undertake its mission to provide security, and it's to and there are a whole range of activities that take place as a result of that, but that's the primary mission, and the approach is that if you can provide capacity for security, that enables other things to happen. Now, as part of providing capacity for security, some construction projects are done or civil works are done, which support that. That's all to the good. But the judgment on whether we would do that and the value that we attribute to those projects is really governed by those primary objectives of supporting the capacity of the Afghan National Army to provide security services for the Afghan community.
So,
and some of those activities may, over time, have a collateral benefit in terms of development and aid assistance. And some of those activities may be eligible for categorisation under overseas development of assistance expenditure categories.
how can you determine if they have a collateral benefit if you're not evaluating?
I said may.
But how can it may have a collateral benefit if you stop looking at those projects, as you said, once you hand them over?
Well, there's a number of issues in that, but there is a point where you hand over to the local community and it's really in the hands of the community as to how they use these resources which are made available to them. And so, in a sense, there's a whole range of different ways in which you might approach that, and a whole range of judgments that might be made by different community groups or interest groups about, what value means. But secondly, the ADF has a particular mission. I mean, I think I said in my last evidence, the ADF is not an aid organisation. So its mission is governed by its support for the development of the capacity of the 4th Brigade to provide security. And that determines priorities, that determines what is done, and that determines judgments about the success or otherwise of the mission. Now, my view is that many of these projects have value to the community. In a sense, it's in the hands of the community to, use them in ways that support what the community wants and needs. The question about going back and checking on them and continuing to evaluate them, that's something that in relation to those projects we don't know because of we just don't have access to them at the moment, or we haven't actually done that work.
So you just said, Mr. Sargeant, that ADF's not an aid organisation. However, you have money that is ODA eligible. So how are the projects assessed for effectiveness and how they fit with the Millennium Development Goals? Is that part of your work?
No.
Even though you're using ODA money?
Well, no, we're not using ODA money. We're using defence.
Well, ODA eligible.
We're using defence appropriations, which support defence activity in Afghanistan, and some of the categories of expenditure are within the ODA guidelines for expenditure on aid. But we don't think about that when we do activity. I mean, from our perspective, it doesn't matter whether it's ODA eligible or not. The concern is the mission that the ADF has to pursue, and ensuring that what is done is going to achieve that mission in the minimum possible time.
If you could, to